We're going to discuss this really interesting topic of how is it that using cold can actually switch off trigger points. So to understand that, you've got to go back to how trigger points are set up. There's a tiny little sensory nerve called a spindle, which is in a spiral, and it, when it reaches a certain stretch, will send a message in a simple reflex arc up to the spinal cord, through the dorsal horn, talk to another nerve, back to the muscle, and tell the muscle to contract. The simplest of reflex arcs. The trigger point occurs when the little spindle becomes sensitized. In other words, it shifts into protection mode, gets stuck there, and then even though the muscle is of normal length and the sensor says it's still abnormal, sends a message which causes the muscle to go into a protective spasm. So that's a trigger point, a neuromuscular malfunction. So now what happens is, and it's just humming along like this, got a life of its own. Now, if you apply cold, and the cold needs to be very cold, to the skin outside this underlying neuromuscular loop, what you do is, as you put the cold on, you don't leave the cold, you put the cold and move it. And as you apply the cold to the skin, there are thermal receptors. These are tiny little nerves which pick up the cold message. The cold message also goes to the spinal cord. And it goes via sensory fibers. So now it's in the same segment as the muscle and as the spindle. So the message from the cold, from the skin, which is a very powerful sensor, very, very sensitive sensor, that message zips into the spinal cord in the same segment, into the dorsal horn, and it interferes with the simple loop which is humming along. You then put in a very cold, powerful message which comes into the same place, interferes with it, and it actually downregulates it, interferes and turns it down. So if you leave the cold on, then the muscle starts to go into spasm as a reflex to the cold. And if you leave it on long enough, you'll start to get shivering. But everybody knows that when you feel cold, you feel tense inside. So leaving the cold on is not the plan. The plan is to just put in a cold message which zips down to the spinal cord, interferes with the message from the little loop, and so breaks the cycle. And then you move along. It's been found that by going from the origin to the insertion, moving at a particular rate, which is about 2 centimeters a second, that kind of rate, and going into the pain zone interferes with the whole process. That's the messages from the spindle and the messages from the overlying fascia, because the overlying fascia is also turned on and sensitized, and it is the big part of the reason why you get these complex pain patterns over the body, because the fascia has a very complex neural network as well. So that's how the cold works. There is also, and this is more in the realm of theory, there is a descending inhibitory pathway, and it's, there's an old saying that if you've got a headache, drop something on your toe and you forget your headache, which is fundamentally how our pain system works, or our sensory system works. Is there is one major message which shoots into your brain, your attention goes to that message, and other messages get less. So, and one of the ways that other messages become less is there's a descending inhibitory pathway which turns on and says, this is not so important, that's the thing you should listen to. So putting cold onto the area may also because as you put the cold on the person, ooh, is like this, it may also stimulate the descending inhibitory pathway and so further down-regulate and break that cycle. So it's everything to do with how nerves function in your body, and that's how this works. Similar to putting a needle, to ischemic pressure, to massage, stripping, and then the stretch. All of these are there to influence and break this little irritating reflex arc, which is what actually maintains trigger points. So it was also found that the cold on its own, even though it interfered with the cycle, if that's all you did and you stretched the muscle out, there was a degree of post-treatment pain. And again, just by experimentation, Travell and Simons found that if they apply heat afterwards and then do a stretch, that the degree of post-treatment pain was minimized. Again, by putting heat on, you're stimulating again, the little thermal nerve endings. You're putting a different kind of message in, which isn't such a shock symptom. It's a much lower, slower, more gentle. And again, we all know that putting heat into an area causes a reflex relaxation. Probably, again, via the same kind of neural pathway. But I haven't seen any good studies really explaining quite why heat helps. We do know that living in a warmer environment, again, tends to make people more relaxed. It changes. We have temperature and other very significant regulators in our hypothalamus, which is deep in the midbrain, which send messages down to your pituitary and then change the hormonal mix, especially the amount of cortisol that is produced, the amount of adrenaline and noradrenaline that's created in your system. So it down-regulates your fight and flight response. That's my best explanation, but definitely it's a very well observed fact that putting heat on after the cold or after the ischemic pressure or any other, or the needling, putting heat on afterwards reduces post-treatment soreness of trigger points. And if you do that, well, you truly enhance the experience for the person that you're treating. Thanks.